Those. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program today, in our All Things Canada edition, but also All Things Eastern Europe, we are joined by two guests. We are actually joined by two of the finest Canadian truth-telling, myth-busting historians, NGO critics, media critics. We have Yves Engler coming to us from Montreal, and Yves is a part of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and also as an anti-imperialist activist and part of Disruption Canada, along with several other groups. And we're also joined returning champion Richard Sanders, who is a founder of the anti-arms trade organization, the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade. He's also a journalist, media critic, NGO critic, and a long time a peace activist. And and we're here to talk about what a great week, what a great week's actually come out of like my long hibernation of not doing interviews and whatnot because of Nazi gates. And so first off, Yves, Richard, thank you both for coming on, especially on such short notice.
Thanks for having us.
It's it's an honor to have you. And let's get straight into it. So in case people have been under a rock, I'll just quickly summarize what happened. So Vladimir Zelensky, of course, he's on his he's on his touring, he's touring every place, demanding more arms, more escalation of this awful war between between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, and of course the Russian invasion. So he's on his give me money to escalate this war. And he was at the Canadian Parliament, and there was a special guest that the Speaker of the House asked everybody to pay tribute to, and he got two standing ovations. And it turns out that this person that was being hailed was very much a Nazi collaborator, or certainly fought with the Nazis when when Germany invaded Ukraine and so forth. And it's been a big controversy. The Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, was forced to resign. Many people are finger wagging at the at the ruling Liberal Party for this, and the Conservatives are demanding how could how could this guy be how could people not know about this guy's background, and he had been invited. And I'll get both of your, and I would love both of your reactions on what I think is a fake outrage coming from the Conservative Party and the NDP, and even the Bloc, the Quebec Bloc. But briefly, Richard, first, briefly give your response on on what happened, followed by Yves, and then we'll get to the nitty gritty of of how this is not an aberration, but this is part of Canada's long, ghastly history of propping up, lionizing, and airbrushing and whitewashing Nazism and Canadian support for Nazism. So, Richard, So Richard, give your response, followed by.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The speaker resigning, I mean, basically he's a fall guy. He's taking all the responsibilities like a sacrificial, lamb or whatever that's going down to protect the herd.
Yeah.
And they're all just pretending that they didn't know anything about it, and that nobody likes Nazis, and they've been, not only did they bring thousands of them over here, and hundreds of thousands of other Nazi sympathizers from Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. I mean, right after the war, when they were denying Jews and communists entry into Canada, So, and he was introduced as a guy, a Ukrainian hero who fought against the Russians during the Second World War. So they had no excuse for, for jumping to their feet and clapping wildly for this guy twice. Um, yeah, so it's and now so that now they're scrambling to basically cover up the complicity that the collaboration that's been going on by both the liberals and conservatives for 70 years or whatever it's been. It's kind of like they're trying to do their best to do the damage control to keep it all under a lid because they don't want it really to come out at all that this has been going on for ever since there were Nazis. Mackenzie King loved Hitler. Anyway, I could go on, but that's my sort of immediate off the top of my head reaction.
Response. You're on mute, Steve.
I find it interesting to actually try to consider that. Like, this is clearly an outgrowth of a bunch of policies that are deeply held across the political spectrum. But I do actually wonder if the PMO office did look at this, because I think a somewhat more thinking, politically astute person probably would have caught that this was going one step too far. That's my guess, but I don't know. But clearly, this flows out of basically just the jingoism of in some ways the speech that Trudeau gave later in the evening in Toronto to a partisan kind of Ukrainian crowd was even more like he was just like vehement with "we're going to fight to the end, we're going to win this war," and this whole kind of like just real warmongery kind of speech. And so obviously this flows out of the fact that Canada is a staunch supporter of the NATO proxy war, staunch supporter of NATO historically, and has a long history of Ukrainian far right Nazi, neo-Nazi sympathies, or organizing, bringing them in, etc. But I wonder, there's a couple other interesting parts to it that are kind of so if this happens 25 years ago, pre-social media, like if you look at what happens, the initial reaction, right? The CBC, Toronto Star, they report this like above board as if this was like a legit, celebrated this Ukrainian hero, whatever. There's nothing like critical or questioning in their initial coverage. And it's on the national, it's on CBC, the national. And I should also say, like, they didn't show all of the House of Commons. They pulled this clip, right? So like they didn't show the whole thing in the House of Commons. It was probably a couple hours, and they pulled a couple seconds or minute or what, right? So if there isn't the social media reaction, and that's also totally fascinating, what happens with the social media reaction. Like I watched that early. Canada Files, Aiden at Canada Files is really early on. The University of Ottawa professor Ivan Kaczynowski, I pronounce his name. He gets some of the images up pretty quick. He's not I don't believe he's the first person who actually kind of raises it on Twitter, but it's entirely people who are critical of the NATO proxy war who are pushing this in the first 24 hours. None of the groups that end up getting quoted, like the Israel lobby groups, the Polish groups, none of them put any statements out, right, in the first 36, 48 hours. The Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs doesn't actually put out a tweet until they announce there's an apology coming, right? Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center is a little bit earlier. I'm not sure about B'nai B'rith. So they really like totally wait. And then you look at a whole bunch of these other people. I've gone actually back because I've seen people who have talked now, like a couple of days later, they talk about how outraged they watched it. in the House of Commons, how they're outraged immediately. And then I went back to their Twitter account. I'm like, that's interesting, but you didn't say anything on Twitter in the first 72 hours, right? Like, you were outraged right away, but you waited. And I saw all these other people who were announcing it on Twitter. And so basically, the people who care about power are going to be very hesitant to go off of side of the whole of Canada's parliament standing up and cheering for some dude, right? Like, they're going to be very hesitant. And obviously all the Israel lobby groups, like I mentioned, a lot of the, these corporate journalists too, the MacArthur at the Toronto Star is one of them, even David Moscrop. I went back and looked at how long it took them to start talking about it. Now they're all, it's just condemning left and right? But so if this happens 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, whatever, before this social media kind of thing, what happens? It wouldn't surprise me if you have a week later, you have a lefty columnist, like a Rick Salutin, writes a critical commentary in his Toronto Star column, or, whatever, some individual, Linda McQuaig back in the time when she had a column, writes a critical column a week later, and it basically disappears. Whereas the social media thing, just like the Canada Files clip, their tweet I looked a couple of days ago, had more than 3 million views, right? Kaczynowski's stuff, he says there are over 6 million views, right? So it just went boom. And it was entirely people who were critical of the NATO proxy war, who were like, oh my God, they've just completely taken this to the next step. And I actually also think people who assumed that it wouldn't lead to a big spiral like it ended up leading to right now, it's been front page of the paper for the last, week. And also one other thing that contributed really to flipping it and to pressuring the Center for Israel Jewish Affairs, B'nai B'rith and them, is that the Jewish Forward had a piece by that guy Lev, I'm forgetting his name. He's a Ukrainian background, who's written critically about the far right in Ukraine. He got a piece up really quickly, and I saw even someone like David Puglisi, the Ottawa Citizen reporter, good, the best there is in the corporate media. He was slow.
He's one of those honorable exceptions to the.
He was very slow on Twitter in putting out. He puts out the Jewish Forward article, and so he frames it as this is from the Jewish Forward. He knows the background. This is somebody who's written about this issue previously, but he also knows we're living in a political climate where talking about this stuff is very outside of bounds, right? And you can get yourself in trouble if you're trying to be in the establishment or even around the periphery of the establishment. Anyway, so to see how the process of the scandal plays out and how there's all these fence sitters, right, who clearly saw it on Twitter but waited until there was something they could kind of whether it's an article from the US, kind of a venerable Jewish Forward outlet, or it's sort of the numbers have gotten so high that now I can come out, and then it all, of course, all snowballs from there. But so yeah, there's a interesting question in my mind about this. Is this one of the few times where the sort of left social media was actually able to really exert itself in a pretty significant and important way?
Actually, before I ask this sort of second official question of mine, I had to ask this. So, who was the one that really broke this story that oh my gosh, the Canadian Parliament and Zelensky and the Prime Minister and everybody is applauding a Nazi fighter, a Ukrainian Nazi fighter? Was it was it one of the big Holocaust remembrance groups like the Simon Wiesenthal Center?
It wasn't. That's what I was just saying. It wasn't. It was Canada Files. I mean, I saw it somewhere else before Canada Files. I saw it. I don't know what it was. I can't remember what the account was. Some account. And then Canada Files put it up, and then AP confirmed it. But my understanding how the AP confirmed it is they just named it. They named a unit he was part of, right? Because people were like, well, he fought against the Russians during World War II, so doesn't that mean he was with the Nazis? But they didn't know the what division and whatnot. And then the Associated Press confirmed it, but without any sort of like political context. And then the University of Ottawa professor Kaczynowski found the photos of him back when he was in the unit, found the blog post where he explains that like he was like the best time of his life. He talks about the best time of his life was the Nazi occupation of what is now Western Ukraine. And so no, it was very clearly this was, and actually there's actually right wingers, that Mark Burry, who's this like total proponent of the NATO proxy war. 3 or 4 days after, he tweets about this, like saying exactly what I'm saying, but from a pro-NATO proxy war perspective. So he's like, oh, you guys have all been duped by the pro-Putinists who have been making a big deal of this because they oppose, they support Putin. And so he followed the Twitter, like what happened on Twitter, and he saw that what this was the dynamic was the pro-Putin quotes and what the establishment calls pro-Putin people, who are the ones that actually got this going, and then it sort of spiraled into other institutions. And if you look at the early statements also that you come out from B'nai B'rith and Francis Simon Wiesel Center, they're very clear and strong in their language. We are not criticizing what is going on in Ukraine. Like, we are supportive of what is going on in Ukraine. They're very, very, very clear about that in their first statements. They drop that later on, right? Later on, that's no longer. They just start talking about the sort of how outrageous it was to have a Nazi in the House of Commons being applauded. But initially, they're very they want to make it clear they're not making any criticism of the NATO proxy war. That
is that is so bizarre. So that's a perfect segue actually to this question, which is given the recent controversy that took place in Parliament with this honoring of a Ukrainian Nazi, I've seen the National Post, their local Post Media's local Toronto branch, the Toronto Sun, talk about Canada's history of harboring Nazi war criminals and collaborators. And I've also been observing on Twitter and elsewhere that people who are mostly silent on Canadian imperialism, they've condemned what happened, but also pro-NATO leftists, have also been speaking out, on this. But so, Richard, so does this mean that we can now, without being marginalized and smeared, that Canada is supporting reactionary movements in Ukraine that lionize Nazi figures like Stepan Bandera, and very much Canada is supporting far right ultra-nationalist Ukrainians? So are we now at a point where we can say those inconvenient truths? Richard, I'm curious your response on that, followed by Yves.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think it'll ever be safe to be too critical. They're always going to find, like, they'll throw the pro-Putin swear words at us, I guess. Which I want to go back to the previous discussion, though. I mean, I wonder when RT and Sputnik and TASS started reporting it. Where did Aidan Jonah from Canada Files, how did he get alerted to it? He might have seen it on RT. I saw it on RT, and it was on, at least on Sunday. I think it might have been on Saturday. So I don't know. Like, have you looked into that? How quickly they reported it? Because it might have been the literal pro-Putin journalism that did actually report it first.
Might be.
So that
it might be, but it wouldn't be RT. It would have been. It was a Twitter account. So by Friday, it gets
what you saw was on a Twitter account.
Yeah, but by Friday afternoon, Friday evening, it starts going on Twitter, and then it starts
Oh, okay.
going more and more wild. It wouldn't surprise me. I think it is possible that it was actually the Russian propaganda system, because there is a let's be clear on
Why do
Twitter.
you why would you call it a Russian propaganda system? They're just reporting in their reaction to this
Oh, well, I
to
mean,
this horror.
I think that there is. I think that there, the Russian government, the NATO, the U.S. government, they have Twitter accounts, they have social media, whole like elaborate social media
Yeah.
uh, plans, operations, whatever you want to call it. I have absolutely no evidence to suggest that's where the clip, because people started playing the clip, right? CBC has a clip. There was obviously thousands, tens of thousands of people who were watching this live, right? There was a CPAC, video of it. There was, right. So I'm not sure exactly what time it's at. I think it's like at sometime at like noon or noonish on Friday that it's taking place. But by the evening, it's starting to circulate in these sort of left-wing Twitter milieus that I'm obviously in, and that's how the algorithm works. I think there are Russian bot accounts, and there are Russian this and that accounts that are Russian aligned or Russian affiliate, whatever you want to call it, however that are
But
part of this.
there's also just Russian journalists and Russian politicians and Russian people
Russian
who
people.
be noticing this sort of thing and saying, "Wow, this is
In all
incredible."
that
They're
said,
Yeah,
in all
no, no, I
like,
agree. My guess is I don't my in this case, like I said, Canada Files was very early. Aiden Jonah, Canada Files, gets he has a couple tweets. He has his one, and then he has one that he says where when he has the Associated Press confirming it. I'm almost certain those are both out by Friday at like by 8 p.m. Like and like I said, I saw it from another account as well, and
well,
then University of Ottawa. So yeah, I mean,
my my feeling is that all this stuff about Hunka and all the minute details about what we're talking about now are really irrelevant. This is not what's important. What's important for people to know is the 70 years of history that the Canadian government has been supporting uh, fascist glorifying organizations. To focus on individuals like Hunka or the Rota, the speaker, or Trudeau, all these individuals, this individual said this and I don't know about that, and this happened there, like the minutiae of it. We're missing the systemic, institutionalized, ongoing collaboration between the liberal and conservative parties and Nazis, literal Nazis, that's been going on since actually before the war. Mackenzie King went over and met Hitler. The leaders of these two countries actually met before the war. And Mackenzie King is very clear in his diary. I mean, in his diaries, that he basically loved Hitler. Like he thought he was the greatest thing, the greatest guy. He just loved him. He talked about looking into his eyes, and his eyes were like the Joan of Arc, and he talked about. He said he wrote letters to Hitler, and we have the excerpts from those, and he talked about how I think what you're doing, you are a savior for your people and possibly for the world. You are the best hope for world peace. Like he literally, Mackenzie King, the leader of Canada, the longest standing leader of Canada, said that before the war. And he was praising Hitler for years up until 1939. So,
and
like, this has
and
been going
and,
on since
and of
before
course
the war. It's been
and of
going on since
course,
before the war.
and of course, Canada, France, Britain, and the United States all de facto supported the fascist, the fascist side, the fascist takeover of Spain and Portugal. But
Yeah.
then, but then
And then
all
we
that,
have the book. Sorry.
yeah,
Well, then in the U.S., the Bush family was actually funneling money to the Nazis in the 30s before the war. They were funneling money from all these huge corporate oligarchs in the U.S., bankers and big, billionaires and whatnot. They were funneling money through the banks that they own. Bush's family bank, like George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush,
Yeah.
had this bank called the Union Bank Company, and they had their money taken away from them by the U.S. government eventually. That money was confiscated. It was given back to them later, and then they used that money to invest in the oil industry. That's how the Bush family got into oil, because they used that money. They were funneling money to the Nazis. So I mean, where did Hitler's money come from? It came from big bankers and corporations and whatnot, because Hitler promised to destroy the biggest threat to them, which was communism, and the Soviet Union was the country that represented communism at the time, and so they wanted to destroy it, and Hitler promised to do that for them, and so they invested all this money in this guy because they had great hope for him. They hoped he could do what he said he was going to do. I'm going to destroy the Soviet Union. Okay, great. Here's billions of dollars. And so this has been going on for so long, and it's a inconvenient history, as you like to call it, and it's a good way to put it.
But do you and Eve think that now that this has happened, and again, it's very interesting that it was the Canada Files that broke the story later. The AP and much of Canada's corporate state media is reporting on this, and like I said, you have the National Post and the Toronto Sun that keeps reporting that now keeps doing these very short articles about Canada's history of harboring Nazis, and so.
That's a history
and again, people who have mostly been silent on the Western support, the Western coup that happened in Ukraine, where a center-right government which believed in bilingualism in Ukraine is overthrown, replaced by a pro-NATO Poroshenko, who, like other Western-backed Ukrainian government, only wanted Ukrainian to be its sole language, and wanted to get rid of all monuments that to those Soviets that fought against Nazism. So all that being said, yeah. And again, we've not been anyone who says that Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown in a Western-backed coup, and the movements that the West is supporting in Ukraine are people who lionize Stepan Bandera, a Nazi war criminal, and and all of those people who believe in stands with Ukraine, and they're wearing Ukrainian flags, but it has fascistic symbols. That symbol comes from Svoboda, a Nazi party, that a neo-Banderite party. Anyone who says that, and anyone who says that, and even when people express that, and even when people like even myself, when we express that we don't support Russia, we don't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we understand why they did it, because the West provoked it. It's called Putin. Putin puppet and stuff like that. You guys are just recycling propaganda from like Russia and stuff like that. Or they'll say things like, Stepan Bandera, yeah, he may have sided with like the Nazi invaders, but he was only doing it because he was fighting against Russian imperialism, Russian Tsarism, and later Soviet-ism. So you have lefties punching. So you have the left who punches left on this. But I'm just wondering, but the fact that now that this has happened, and now that you have like corporate media, CBC and the National Post and so forth, reporting on this, will this give us a chance to now say to people that that who we're supporting in Ukraine is a reactionary movement, And not only are we supporting neo-Nazis, in Ukraine, but we have some in power. We have a deputy, a former deputy prime minister, who's now in charge of like economic affairs, Chrystia Freeland, whose grandfather was a Nazi. So yeah. Long story short, do you think like that we'll be able to finally break this taboo and people realizing that enough is enough to stop supporting the proxy war in Ukraine and all that?
I don't think that that all the truth is going to come out. All that dirt that is there, it's still deeply covered up. They haven't even mentioned anything about the organization that represented the Waffen-SS Galicia in Canada. They had an organization of veterans. This guy was a member of it, and that's what he wrote, where he wrote about his time during the war, was in the Combatant publication that was issued by this association of Nazi veterans in Canada, and that association was a member and still is a member of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is an umbrella organization that contains many different associations and organizations and all sorts of different kind of groups, women's groups, youth groups, credit unions, you name it. They're all right wing. But if you look in what the news stories of the last week, there's nothing about the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. There's not a thing has been said. Nobody has said anything about it in the news story, right? So they represented for all those decades this Veterans Association, and the UCC has been led over the decades, the past several decades. The presidents are always Banderites. Hardcore Banderites are always elected over the last few decades to become the presidents. And the UCC was created by the Canadian government in 1940. This is a creature of the Canadian government because there was a split in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, this fascist Ukrainian organization in Europe that split. And the Banderites were on one side and the Melnikites were on the other side. And the Canadian government was quite concerned that these fascists were fighting amongst themselves. And so it facilitated the creation of this organization. It was originally called the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, but it changed its name, I think, in the 80s or 70s or something to Ukrainian Canadian Congress. But anyway, and the purpose of that was to bring the Ukrainian fascist supporters together. And, that was done to squash the left-wing Ukrainians who had dominated the scene in Canada before that, but also to, well, anyway, so the point is, get back to the media, the issue of whether it's safe for us to or whether we have a chance. Of course, we have a much increased chance now to get the word out about the institutionalized, deep, systemic collaboration between the government and these fascist glorifying organizations. But, it's still very limited. We're going to get, what's going to happen is a classic thing where it's called a limited hangout, right? A limited hangout. That's what's going to happen. It's already, they're creating the limited hangout, and it'll be to reveal a certain amount of the truth, as little as they can, but then that will be it. You can't go beyond that.
In other words, this is an aberration. Eve, your response to what Richard just said.
Well, no, I think that's correct. I think this is sort of like tells us a lot about how the media works, right? In that there's a certain degree of freedom. Like these scandals can actually bubble up, and it is embarrassing. There's no doubt that this is embarrassing for those who are on board for the NATO proxy war, and this undercuts the narrative and puts, Ottawa and a certain degree, Zelensky and even Washington to some extent on the back foot a little bit on this issue. And it clearly like what you're talking about, like this sort of like leftish world on Twitter that's been like calling those criticizing what's going on tankies. This puts them really on the back foot, right? This kind of, but the propaganda system is simultaneously, so one way it shows sort of a degree of like openness, but then simultaneously it shows that how like closed it is, because they keep the conversation so darn narrow in what they're
Right. And
yeah.
In other words, I think
Like
well,
I just want to put the scandal is like this. First of all, the whole frame right away, the wording of it's just an error. It was just an error of the parliamentary speaker. And that may be true in the most narrow sense of that word, right? Like it may have been an error in the sense that if the more sophisticated vetting world had properly vetted this, they may have caught that this was probably a PR, right? It may not have been an error at all. This may have come right from Chrystia Freeland's on, right? This might have come. I don't think. My guess is probably not, but I would say it's at least 10%, 20% chance that this was like, okay, we're going to try to in this sort of like zeitgeist of like war, Zelensky, we're going to try to push our long-standing, Nazi Ukrainian nationalist Banderite, whatever you want to call it, kind of project, right? That's possible. We've seen other examples of Chrystia Freeland when she rallied in Toronto a year ago, where she was behind that, banner. The slogans they chant, these are all like, Banderite slogans. They're chanting Slava Ukraini and all that stuff. So I think that's
symbols of Svoboda. Those are the movements they supported in in the supposedly people power Euromaidan pro EU pro NATO coup. That happened. In fact, Yves, reading the CBC article and listening to the CBC talking to a member of the Simon Wiesenthal Center at the end of the conversation, the CBC journalist or junk journalist said the following, that already Russia's propaganda network is already seizing on this, is already weaponizing this. So
well, this is exactly.
So they're already in real time even spinning the story to be like, yes, it was an accident that we invited this Nazi, but you know what? We're still, we are supporting freedom in Ukraine, and all of you anti-war folks are all just being a bunch of, I don't know, pick whatever adjective that they describe as, useful idiots or Putinists or campists, tankies, and so forth.
Well, we're following the Russian line, or Russian speaking points, or whatever. Is that what they call it? Talking points, I think, is another thing that they say. Or, oh, you're just following the Russian talking points or something. Well, this is exactly what happened when the news broke about Chrystia Freeland's grandfather. Okay, and then there was this blow up of information about her grandfather, but it has still never been reported in any mainstream media that she herself worked for the same publications here in Canada that her grandfather worked for. In fact, I don't think that the mainstream media has ever reported that when he came to Canada, he continued his work as a journalist, and he edited a newspaper in Edmonton, which Chrystia Freeland then went on to work for a few years later after he died. She got a job working for that Ukrainian language Catholic pro-Nazi, like a Nazi glorifying cover-up kind of a newspaper that whitewashed history. And her grandfather also worked on this publication called the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which is now being published by the University of Alberta. Her grandfather moved to France to work with the creator of this encyclopedia, a Ukrainian man who was his boss during World War II. Okay, his boss during World War II was the president of the Ukrainian uh, Central Committee based in Krakow, Polish, like German occupied Poland. And that's where Chomiak, Freeland's grandfather, worked under the leadership of this guy, Kubiovich, who then later, after the war, he created an encyclopedia in order to whitewash history. What better way to whitewash history than create an encyclopedia? It was in the 70s, I think he started that, in the early 70s. So it was before the internet. So the best he could do is write an encyclopedia and coordinate the writing of an encyclopedia. This was the guy, the president of this Ukrainian Coordinating Committee, Central Committee, or maybe it was Coordinating Committee. Anyways, the UCC. And it was created by the military intelligence of the Nazis, the Abwehr. And so after the war, he creates this encyclopedia. Freeland's grandfather, who's a journalist in Edmonton for the Ukrainian right-wing publications, he goes, he was a keynote speaker at a big event for Ukrainian military people in early 60s, like 64. Anyway, so he goes over to France for like 6 months to live with his former boss, who was the coordinating guy. He was the main central character who, he met with the butcher of Poland, and he was the central guy who was leading up this organization that coordinated the collaboration between Ukrainians and the Ukrainian fascists and the Nazis. Okay. And that was Freeland's boss. And then, so after the war, he creates an encyclopedia. Her grandfather goes over, lives with them for 6 months. And then soon after, this guy who coordinated the collaboration between the Ukrainian fascists and the Nazis comes over to Edmonton, and he signs a deal with the University of Alberta in Edmonton for them to take over the English language version of the encyclopedia, which they are still publishing. And they have 4 different endowments there. And one of the endowments is named for Peter Savarin, who was also a Waffen SS veteran. And he was very prominent. He was the vice president of the Conservative Party in Alberta. And he was the chancellor of the University of Alberta. He's the chancellor, and he was a former Waffen SS Galicia guy. So none of this has come out. I published this like years ago, and it should have come out when Freeland was her grandfather. None of this stuff came out, none of her connection to it. So they kept a lid on it. Yeah, they let out the stuff about the grandfather, and they pushed him under the bus. But her connections to the same organizations, the same publications that he was connected with, like she got government-funded jobs. Canadian government-funded jobs to work for that encyclopedia when she was 18. And then, one last thing. That CIUS, the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, that has 4 different, at least when I wrote about it in like 8 years ago, that she had, the CIUS at the University of Alberta had 4 different endowments at that time named after Waffen SS Galicia veterans. One of them was this Peter Savarin, who was the chancellor of the University of Alberta. And by coincidence, when his retirement was announced, there's a little item down, and there's a picture of him and whatnot, and it's saying, "Oh, Peter Savarin's going to retire." Over in the other corner of the page, there's a little announcement. "Oh, CIUS has some new summer students working for us, government funded, like part of our government program." And one of them is Chrystia Freeland. Another one is I think she's the daughter of Chomiak. She's the daughter of Chomiak, of the grandfather. Anyway, none of this has come out yet, and it's been years. And so I don't hold your breath for anything really deep to come out just because of this Nazi guy in Parliament, because everybody's just talking about him, and all the institutional stuff about the organizations and the publications and the government funding of all these things. It might take years more before it'll ever come out.
The Ukrainian Studies at University of Alberta has apparently taken their page down because on Twitter there's been the fact that Honka had a endowment, and then they returned the money, and they announced yesterday or 2 days ago, or whatever it was, that they're going to return the money. But then people started posting all these other ones, including Saverin that you said. It's like that's a really big. It's like he gave like it's about $500,000 back in the 80s, I think, and now it's like that would be worth like $1.5 million today or something. So, anyways, they apparently people
that has come out. Oh, I'm really glad that that's come out.
Not wide, not in the corporate media, not in the corporate.
Oh, not in the corporate media.
Not on Twitter, and but the university's reaction, the institute's reaction, is to take their page down where it names all the people who funded it, because people are going around looking at, was this person in the SS, was it right?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, that information is still is out there in other places. Like where I got it from years ago when I was doing my research was a guy named Per Anders Rudling, who's a Swedish American academic. He's probably a leading guy. He studied at the University of he did his PhD at University of Alberta, and his thesis advisor was Freeland's uncle, because this guy married Komiak's daughter, right? So it's her uncle, and he told me, and he has admitted this in writing in academic papers, that he used to smuggle CIA propaganda into Ukraine to destabilize Ukraine and to cause problems over there. And at the time, he was totally supportive of it, but he later admitted that maybe because someone else blew the whistle on him or something, I'm not sure. But why he admitted it, but he admitted that he had indeed been smuggling this CIA-funded propaganda into Ukraine to try to overthrow.
I have to ask this question
during the USSR.
Huh?
This is
during the Soviet in the 80s, before the destruction of the USSR.
Yeah, but Chrystia Freeland was doing that too. She
did. Yeah. And that's another thing. Okay, so that's another thing about the media. Okay, so I thought I was doing a good thing, exposing all this stuff about Freeland and whatnot. And so when I published the issue 70 on Cold War Canada, it had all this stuff, which I actually had it was revised, and it was expanded upon from stuff that I had written in 2017. But anyway, so when I sent it out to 150 media people, including about 10 writers and editors at the Globe and Mail, and I never heard it back from the Globe and Mail people or from a single mainstream media thing. I sent that whole glossy color 64-page thing that I spent 3 years on, and I sent it with 500 footnotes in it. I sent it to all the media. I didn't get to hear a single thing. But a few months later, the Globe and Mail comes out with an article giving a lot of the same information that I had put in my magazine about Freeland and how she had gone over to Ukraine and was, meddling in the election that was going on there in Soviet Ukraine. But they dug up some KGB files, and they turned her into a hero. Like, they took my stuff and they made her into a freaking hero. Like, she was fighting against the evil Soviets, and hey, isn't it great to have her in our government?
But hasn't that always? Yeah, Yves?
Yeah, I want to say, I totally agree with you. That was the tone of I think there was more than one Globe article. But I bet you that journalist who was doing it was actually trying to get some of your material into the Globe and Mail, and they understood. They understood the only way you could do that is by framing it in this sort of like.
I would look at it in a different way. Like, I think it's part of the creation of the cover story, or the limited hangout. It's to create the limited hangout and to deal with any kind of negative publicity that might come from because the way I framed it was very different. Here she is meddling in another country, and then when she came back to Canada, she was lionized by the Canadian media. There were articles about her because she came back and she had just been harassed by the KGB. They called her in for questioning. She just refused to go, and that was the end of it. They didn't like go and grab her and arrest her or anything. They just asked her if they could talk to her, and she said no, and so they just left it alone. But the Soviet government, in their media, called her a Banderite enemy of the Soviet people, and they put a picture of her in the paper, in some paper, and they made an official complaint to the Canadian embassy.
Well, I believe that it
But
was in
when
that.
she came back, this story came out, and she's like 20 years old or something. The story comes out in the Canadian media, and she used it to launch her journalism career. So it was a bad thing that she spun around, and the media helped her sit around to make it so that she could launch her career.
That's a perfect segue.
The Globe article, I think, had something about how she actually had access to diplomatic pouch.
Yeah, that's right.
So
she was an agent, basically an agent of the Canadian government.
Yeah, she's like a 20-year-old. Like who goes traveling, who goes for like a study abroad, and then has access to like Canadian diplomatic pouch. But no, I don't want to go too far with that point. I think maybe you are correct with your framing of the Globe, but I think it is also, I think there's a lot of people who read that story. It's all framed in the positive light and do think about like, okay, well, who has access to a diplomatic pouch? That's kind of weird. This seems like somebody who's very aligned with, Canadian, CIA, CSIS, whatever, right? Like, but yeah. Anyways, sorry, your question.
But the spin is that it's okay that she does this front work for the CIA and the Secret Service because the Soviet Union is the evil empire, and then of course when people say things like the Soviet Union killed more people than Nazi Germany, Stalin killed more people than Hitler, communism is as evil an ideology as Nazism, and then you have stuff like Black Ribbon Day. That all comes from, and this is a big taboo that we have to push back. That all comes from, all that anti-communist propaganda. That all comes from these Eastern European civil society groups, expat groups, which get funds from the Canadian government, and then they have their American versions, their Australian versions, their New Zealand versions, and whatnot. But all that stuff is propaganda that comes from actual runaway Nazis.
Yeah, and then there's this anti-communism monument that they're building. They call it, the memorial or monument to the victims of communism, but I just call it the anti-communism monument, and it's not far from me over here.
But then I have to ask this
organizations question. The organizations that sponsored that monument, which are all funded by the Canadian government, and the monument's largely funded by the Canadian government, and it's given a very prominent location, although they did have to move it from an even more prominent location. And all the parties in Parliament supported it. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
But I have to ask. Jump in on some of that in terms of some of the dynamic, and I was making this point. I wrote it in the piece I did, and I kind of made the point to Richard in our conversation that took place yesterday. But I think that one element of it, I don't think this is just about like communism. I think this is
you're right.
There's a geopolitical dimension, and I think one of the ways, like one of the crazy things that's come out of the Nazigate. The Nazigate, to a large extent, just reflects Russophobia in Canadian political life. It reflects the fact that the Speaker of the House of Commons wanted to celebrate somebody who killed Russians. That was his objective. He said it in the House, and then when he justified what he'd done when it became a bit of a scandal, he repeated it. And yet, no one in the corporate media, or basically no one from what I've seen, has talked about what happened to what the Nazis did to Russians during World War II. So we want to celebrate somebody who killed Russians or tried to kill, I don't know if he did kill, but tried to kill Russians during World War II. But we don't want to talk about what the Nazis did to Russians during World War II. So to me, that's the central part. And then Justin Trudeau's responses both of his apologies doubled down on the Russophobia, right? He doubled down and said this is all Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation. So
Yeah.
I think that's really important. But I also think it's tied to that, and is that, you know, this didn't like okay, so in throughout the Cold War, or the justification was it's the Soviet Union, it's the communists, we gotta target them. But Canada's been at war, effectively at war with Russia for 150 years, right? We sent troops to fight in Crimea with the British in the mid 1850s. We invade in 1917. Then we refuse diplomatic relations throughout the 20s and 30s. There's a short period we have diplomatic relations. Then we're allied with the Soviet Union, but immediately, we during World War II, but then immediately the Americans are dropping nuclear weapons on Japan, partly as a threat to Moscow. And then when the Soviet Union dissolves, then we were trying to use Ukraine as a way to weaken Russia, right? So this has a really important geopolitical element. It's always, it was intertwined with anti-communism at different periods. What the main motivating factor is, what is geopolitics, what is but I think that to see some of this stuff in that kind of broader historical perspective, and to me, that's not in any way a justification for what Russia, what Russia's doing in Ukraine, or what Russia has done, in its imperial conquest, and what the Tsars have done, and whatever, right? But it's certainly not a justification for what Canada's doing. Like, I mean, if you sit and think about Ukraine, and like, well, maybe Russian meddling is dubious, but a country that's 10,000 kilometers away is meddling is substantially more dubious.
Yeah.
Anyway, so some of those kind of like the broader look at this stuff, and it's basically Canada's been allied with the two main empires of the past 2 centuries, who have seen Russia for much of that period as a competitor. And so we pick up the anti-Russian sentiment from there, and then and we're willing to back these fascist groups because that fits into our broader hatred of Russia and the USSR.
Well, it's similar in a way. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask this question, which is, why do you think it's only now Holocaust remembrance groups are picking this up, and so why do you think it's only now that Holocaust remembrance groups are picking this up? Because again, Richard has been trying to say to people that all of these seemingly benign civil society groups, like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and all their different Eastern European counterparts, whether from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, now just Czech Republicans, in Slovakia. But why do you think it's only now that Holocaust remembrance groups are saying, are speaking out on this?
When you say Holocaust, you basically mean Francis Anne-Loison Center, B'nai B'rith, CIJA. Now, I think there's a decent chance. Well, actually, I would say for certain, employees, top officials of those groups were watching what was going on in the House of Commons, and at least 1 or 2, CIJA employees or Francis Anne-Loison heard this announcement of like, we're celebrating somebody who fought Russia, and right away knew, well, if you were fighting Russia, then it means you were with the Nazis, and we're like, okay. I almost guarantee you by Friday, later in the day of Friday, that there was a discussion that happened internally within those organizations, and they were like, should we or shouldn't we put a statement out? That the discussion began. They don't do it until, like I said previously, they don't do it until the Jewish Forward, until it's left. NATO proxy war critics are going wild with it on Twitter. The Jewish Forward publishes a piece, the US-based outlet, even the fact that the Canadian Jewish news was very, very slow. They haven't touched it until like multiple days later. That in of itself speaks to how, the Jewish Forward in the States is not really too worried about Canadian political power dynamics. CJN would be much more concerned about some of that stuff.
But all of these groups, but all of those groups, it's important to know the groups that you just mentioned, like Francis Simon Wiesenthal, are all Zionist groups, right? As well,
they're all deeply they're all very deeply anti-Palestinian groups, and they're all groups that are deeply anti-left groups. Okay, but let's also be really, at some they're mostly about protecting Israel's apartheid, but they also do have there is like a base of Jewish community members who have family members who were victims of the Nazi Holocaust. They have to represent some degree of what they say they're about, and so this thing sort of spiraled to the point where they had to come out. And now I do believe, and that's not to say I believe they are genuine. And if you go back historically at different periods, they were genuinely targeting Nazis that had gotten safe haven, and that's part of why that commission in the 1980s takes place. Is my understanding is that groups like the Canadian Jewish Congress are pushing the government to look at these why there are these former Nazis in Canada, but these organizations are very much cognizant of being part of the establishment and not being offside with sources of power. And so, they're not going to be the first ones out when the House of Commons gives a standing ovation for somebody. They ain't going to be the one. They don't want to go up against the House of Commons. That's not how they operate. And so
I'd like to, okay, sorry, go finish your
I just finish on this now. This is going a bit of an aside. I do think I'm someone who's really clear. I see CIJA, I see B'nai B'rith, I see Friends of Simon Wiesenthal. They are organizations that are deeply anti-Palestinian and deeply anti-leftist. And I believe that just like what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, if anybody similar type politician in Canada got, let's call it a Nikki Ashton maybe, got anywhere close to power, these organizations would do everything in their power to kibosh that, a more socialistic, anti-imperialistic kind of political movement, government, whatever. So I'm very cautious about giving credit, lauding, and I have to say, there's those groups because one right here now they are deeply anti-Palestinian and also they are anti-leftist, and that has medium and long-term consequences for a left-wing project. I'm surprised at how much that doesn't seep into the left discourse. Like there's a lot of people on the left who've been talking about this recent stuff who don't seem to have any problem with sort of celebrating Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center in their pushback against this. I think that's a major strategic mistake. Again, principally for Palestinians in the short term, but even medium long term for the left more generally. But yeah.
In fact, that's a perfect segue. I want to actually read out what the guy from the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal said because we have to in terms of how we move forward and bring these descendants of far-right Eastern European movements into account, the Chrystia Freelands of the world into account, I think it's very important to read out this because there is this anti-Russia, the anti-communism industry has now morphed into this just anti-all things Russia industry, and I know for a fact a lot of times when people say that Stepan Bandera, this guy that Zelensky says has made into a holiday of Zelensky Stepan Bandera, that he was a Nazi war criminal, and then the spin is that he may have collaborated with the Nazis, but he only did it to fight against Russian Tsarism, imperialism, and now Soviet imperialism. But I want to read this quote of what the guy from Friends of Simon Wiesenthal said. And wait, let me just try to find it first. Okay, so he said the following. The fact that this individual, and he's talking about the guy who, Hunka, the fact that this individual, and by proxy, the organization he was a member of, was given a standing ovation in the House of Commons is deeply troubling. I think association with this unit makes you a Nazi collaborator. To be part of this unit, you swore allegiance to Hitler and you were involved in the massacre of civilians. So it doesn't matter if you try and claim you were defending against communism. You were still involved with the Nazi war machine. That makes you complicit. But then, of course, the guy then later says this. Pannerton said that he believes that solidarity with Ukraine in its fight against Russian invasion is incredibly important. However, solidarity cannot tolerate the distortion or outright celebration of Nazi collaboration or war crimes. So in future events, people have to be a lot more careful about who they're associating with when they're expressing support and solidarity for the very just cause of Ukraine. Richard, your response followed by me.
One thing I want to, I found this quote. You're reading quotes, so now I feel obliged. I have to read a quote. So this is the oath. This is a segment of the oath that Hunka and all the thousands of other volunteers for the Waffen-SS Militia said when they became members. I swear before God that in the battle against Bolshevism, I will give absolute obedience to the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces, Adolf Hitler, and as a brave soldier, I will always be prepared to lay down my life. So they're promising to fight to the death in absolute obedience to Hitler, and they're swearing before God to fight Bolshevism. This shows you how deeply similar the Nazis were with the Ukrainian fascists. They both believed in ethnic cleansing, etc.
Exactly, and but then that leads to this question, which is, and how can I say this? Because I mean, isn't it basically long overdue, though, that the left, because there are a lot of leftists that support that not only that supported the coup against Viktor Yanukovych, there are leftists that support NATO. There are leftists who really do think that we're on the right side of history, the West supporting Ukraine, in spite of the fact that the Azov battalion are a bunch of neo-Nazis and they lionize Nazi war criminals and so forth. But that being said, now that some leftists, including ones who are normally silent on Canadian imperialism, do you think that we'll start to see? Do you think that this will be the start of hopefully people moving beyond anti-communism leftism? Because the reason why a lot of those civil society groups flourished was because a lot of left-leaning people are, the Western left is mostly anti-communist leftism.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have some like massive ramifications on being anti-communist in a macro thing. I think it is going to have ramifications, and has had ramifications. You can see it very clearly on Twitter. The people who are the sort of real NATO proxy war proponents have gotten they're quiet. They put up tweets about, this doesn't change the dynamics in Ukraine, like these very defensive kind of tweets, right? That's very clear. And I think it's particularly going to have an impact on, as I mentioned previously, this sort of people who frame themselves as leftists or whatever, who have been on board for the NATO proxy war, and now that process, they've been softening their tone right early on. And people like Todd Gordon, who wrote a book called Imperialist Canada, early in the after the Russian invasion, he was denouncing me as like a campist and stuff like that. He was like so hardcore on social media denouncing anyone who's saying, hey, Canada's not like, NATO expansion, Canada's role in all this isn't a good thing. He's gone quiet now. That's been now for a while. He's gone quiet, and other people like that.
And of course, activists within the UCC and pseudo academics like Marcus Kolga were very instrumental in counseling a lot of events, which the World Socialist website, the Socialist Equality Party of Canada,
and Dimitri's tour, Dimitri Lascaris' tour, and stuff like that. Yeah, no, the UCC and them were, and I think this kind of stuff will put them in a bit of a weaker position. But it's not going to be, unless there's real, other campaigning, it's not going to be that significant. Having said that, there's also some dynamics going on in the actual war that are clearly putting the whole sort of NATO position in a weaker spot, and that clearly the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed. And there's more and more stories not in the Canadian, there's very few in the Canadian, but in US corporate media has had now, it's still a small sliver of the overall total of stories, but has all the major publications, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Politico, whatever, have all reported that it's failing, and that the US has been really pushing for basically have more Ukrainians die. The US has been really sort of like pushing them to be, more bold in their efforts to break Russian lines, and so there's some broader kind of like and specifically war developments that are also going to have an impact. NATO still seems to be in the perspective of doubling down and just escalating, which we're going, even closer towards the ultimate, nuclear kind of whatever. But I think there's a pretty good chance that that in fact what happens is that, especially with U.S. elections coming up, that you have actually a sort of backing away from the proxy war.
Richard, you're a historian, and reading your investigations, you tackled this thing called Black Ribbon Day, and this whole historical arguments that that the Soviet Union and by and large the communist system has killed more people than Nazism. Communism is just as evil and violent ideology as Nazism and fascism. Of course, this whole Black Ribbon Day and that argument comes from these runaway Nazi war criminals and those well-funded Eastern European civil society groups. But again, that's been repeated also by many, left-leaning people, and much of the Western left, and by and large, even a lot of the global left, is an anti-communist. They subscribe to anti-communist, leftism and so forth. But your investigation really debunks all of that. So, do you think, with with Nazigate, and the fact that now many people are starting to, I hope many people are starting to go, maybe maybe all those people who who are saying we're supporting Nazis in Ukraine, we should not be on board with NATO. Do you think that we'll start to see a lot of people moving beyond anti-communist leftism in light of what happened this week and over the weekend?
Well, I think that it's much easier now to present these ideas about the Nazi support that the Canadian government's support for Nazi glorifying organizations and whatnot. I mean, and that it sort of gives us a bit of a breathing space to do things that we couldn't do before, and the mainstream media will be looking for other examples of Nazi things in Ukraine that they otherwise in the past they would have covered it up or ignored it, or, oh, well, we better not mention that. But now it's sort of okay to mention the Nazi thing. In fact, if you're a journalist, maybe even more so if you're a young rising up journalist, you might go, well, here's a chance for me to get a little bit on the map here. I can do a story about this or that. They might notice something, that some Nazi connection. But I want to bring up something, a sort of a parallel situation. Okay, so we were talking about Holocaust memorial or remembrance groups. So how many million Jewish people were killed? Usually they say like 6 million, right?
Yeah.
By the Nazis. Okay. So, but the Nazis killed maybe 27 million Soviets. Now, some of them would have been Jewish, but I'm not sure if they're included in the 6 million or not. But anyway, or is it just gas chambers that they're counting, or the Holocaust of bullets?
Also, Poland itself, even Polish people, not of a Jewish background, but just of a Polish background,
yeah.
Polish background.
Yeah.
I mean, what the Nazis did. I mean, no, but yeah.
So what I'm going to say is, okay, so it's great that that Jewish people can and others who were killed in the Holocaust, because it wasn't just Jewish people that were killed in the Holocaust by the Nazis, but it's great that they can remember that, and they're given space to remember the Holocaust that they suffered, right? Okay, the millions that were killed. Are the Soviets given that same space to remember the Holocaust? Well, maybe I shouldn't call it a Holocaust, but the millions of people, actually many more millions of people that were killed. And I'm going to tell you something that tell people something that maybe they don't know. Okay, so every year, Russian Canadians in different cities celebrate Victory Over Fascism Day, which is May 9th. It was the day that the Nazis signed the defeat, signed and agreed that they had been defeated, right? So on that day, Victory Day, Russian Canadians have traditionally come out and they carry posters and placards and things showing the photographs of the relatives of their fathers, their mothers, their uncle or whatever, who had been killed by the Nazis. And they have a very solemn parade through the streets or at a location. In Ottawa, they have not been able to hold that for the last few years because their venue was taken away from them, and because Ukrainian nationalists came out. Actually, just one guy came and shouted at them and yelled at them at their thing, and then the venue was taken away. It was at the Canadian War Museum that they used to hold it. So they are too afraid now to celebrate victory over fascism. And they played a huge role. The Soviet Union played a massive role. They did the bulk of the work of destroying the Nazis. The turning point in the war was, of course, at Stalingrad. And after that, the Soviet Red Army pushed the Nazis back to Germany, and and pushed them right back to Germany, and basically did most of the work. 9 million Soviet soldiers died in that fight. And so I hope that they will now feel more confident and more safe to hold their events, because like last year or the year before, the Ukrainian nationalists types that are so Russophobic, they put out a petition and got many thousands of signatures on their petition saying that the Victory Day celebrations in Canada should be banned because it's Russian propaganda. Wow. They said that Victory Day celebrations were Russian propaganda. And they did not want them to be celebrating the victory over fascism. If we can't celebrate the victory over fascism, what the heck can we celebrate? I mean, isn't that a sort of a good thing that we did? Like the people of the world that were on the Allied side, we came together. The Russians did. But
it also goes to show you, I think that also goes to show you that us on the left also have to move beyond anti-communist leftism. And I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that we don't, that we don't talk about some of the legitimate grievances that some people do have when it comes to whatever Soviet states, and that we don't completely, whitewash, whatever human rights abuses a Stalin or a Mao did. But that being said, this anti-communism leftism has done us no good, because it's allowed these far-right civil society groups, it's allowed them to flourish. It silences us, it kneecaps our own movements, and then we actually end up doing a lot of self-McCarthyism, self-red baiting by saying, oh, I'm a leftist, but I'm a good kind of leftist. I'm not that communist leftist. And when communists are being suppressed, as many were during the Holocaust, the response is, well, they also supported an evil ideology called communism, and they were Stalinists and so forth. So if you're an actual sincere communist that got suppressed in Latin America, or the Red Scares of a Woodrow Wilson or Joseph McCarthyism, if you were an actual sincere communist, an actual sincere Stalinist, the response is that, well, you got what was coming to you, but it's those social democrats and those New Dealers. They are the worthy victims. The other ones are the unworthy victims, and
but it shows that they not only the strategy on the far right side, and I guess the mainstream right, and also what you're saying, the anti-communist left. The strategy is not just to say bad things about the Soviet Union, to talk about Stalin or whatever, to put down any, to raise their criticisms of the Soviet Union. Another important part of it is to not talk about the good things that the Soviet Union did. Socialized medicine, free universities, and defeating the Nazis. Those are kind of good things. And shouldn't we celebrate those? And anybody who's trying to celebrate them, the Russian community is proud of that history, proud of their role in it, proud of their father, their grandfather, their mother, their uncle or aunt or whatever that fought the Nazis and died fighting the Nazis, or just was killed because the Nazis invaded in the biggest invasion in world history of all time, like Operation Barbarossa, in which the Ukrainian fascists took part. They are proud of those, their family, their tradition, their culture, and that's a huge part of the Russian identity to this day. Even though it's not a communist country, they do have the second biggest party is the Communist Party, and they do are proud of their heritage, and that's one of the main sort of the bulwark. I think it's a major central part of their national identity, is having defeated the Nazis, and they're not even allowed to do it here in Canada.
And 2 points before before we start to wrap up this conversation. But Yves, you wanted to say something?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and of course, this also gets to the very, very thorny topic of the Holodomor or the Holodomor, or the big famine that happened in Ukraine, but happened across the Soviet the Soviet Union, and of course, I still think it's going to be. I still think approaching that topic and saying, okay, look, I know that you think that Stalin was a monster, and yeah, he did do a lot of human rights abuses, but the big famine, that was actually not his fault. That famine that happened was when the Soviet Union was trying to, do collectivization, so forth. But the ultra-nationalist Ukrainians, they basically created they literally dug their own grave, because they sabotaged, a lot of their own grains, and that's why the famine came about. And that this whole the Holodomor, a lot of countries all have myths. Canada, it's the peaceable kingdom. America, the shining city on the hill with the wonderful founding fathers. And the Holodomor, that's, it's just the Soviet Union wasn't inflicting genocide on them. Like, that was just like an experiment gone wrong. They sabotaged their own grains, and then that's what caused the famine. But that still is a very thorny topic. That if you
I think that they slaughtered I mean, it's in Robert Conquest's big book about the Holodomor. He's like this really right-wing guy who worked for British intelligence. He was extreme anti-communist, and he wrote the sort of the classic book on Holodomor. And he talked about how the Ukrainians nationalists who were resisting the Soviet efforts to collectivize, how they slaughtered millions of their cattle, you know, and their different domesticated animals, farm animals. They did it the year before this huge drought hit. So they wiped out all of this food supply. And I think that, but I don't think that's you know, you can't blame it all on that. But that was certainly a factor. It's something to think about, to consider that that may have had a role. If you kill millions of sheep and millions of cows and millions of pigs, literally millions of them, all across in a coordinated effort to sabotage collectivization, because you don't want all of your cow and cattles and whatnot, you know, your domesticated farm animals to become part of this evil Soviet collectivization scheme. It must have had some impact. And then the terrible situation happened with this drought there. And you know, I don't know what degree. I haven't studied this enough. I wish I had enough time. I could spend years. I'd have to spend a lot of time on that and really research it, because, you know, Per Rudling, who I mentioned earlier, the Swedish American guy that studied in Edmonton under Himka, Freeland's uncle, his position. I was, for, you know, in the publications and the articles that I've written, I usually have taken his position on it. He's an academic, he studied it, and I kind of trusted his position on it. And he was saying that, well, for sure, the Ukrainian nationalists have exaggerated the numbers. Like, they generally say there were 10 million or more uh, uh, Ukrainians that died in the time period of that famine. He says the number is more like high twos, threes, 3 million or something like that. And then there's all these academic studies on the number of people that died because of the famine in other states of the Soviet Union. Like, there were quite a few different states where millions of people were dying at the same time as they were dying in Ukraine. And no one's ever said, oh, the Soviet Union was trying to kill millions of people in, you know, whatever those other states were. I'm not sure. But no one accuses them of trying to kill millions of other people in other the other SSRs, you know, like the Soviet Socialist Republics. But the Ukrainians picked it up, and you know, they're really promoting that whole idea, and it's so I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't really have a fixed, for sure idea of that of what exactly the most accurate representation of that horrible event was.
Canadians. It's actually Canadian Ukrainians that have been pushing it. It's the SS. It's the you know, guys like Hudak or Hudung, whatever it is, Yaroslav, the SS, the former soldier, and the Institute University of Alberta. They have a whole Holodomor research thing. And during his speech, Zelensky said that one of the things he said in Parliament was that he praised Canada for having the first monument back in 1983 in Edmonton to the famine, and it's partly used, of course, for the far right Ukrainians to say that they were also victims of a genocide, and therefore joining the Nazis was legitimate because Stalin had tried to genocide them. Even though where the famine actually took place was, my understanding, is mostly not in Western Ukraine. It wasn't in the Galicia region. It was mostly more around Kyiv. And so
interesting.
It wasn't even really, that's my understanding. But yeah, so there's a really important Canadian, and this is the Canadian, like the influence of Canada and Ukraine is really stunning, right? That is at a kind of more broad level, and the extent to which Canadian Ukrainian forces have been pushing. There's this just absolutely stunning. op-ed by, I think it's that Lubitsch at the Royal Military College. Lubitsch, I forget his first name.
Yeah, I know who you mean. Luciak.
Yeah, Luciak. He's at the prof at the Royal Military College.
Yeah.
And when Harper goes to Ukraine in 2010, he's part of the delegation, and Harper goes to a Holodomor monument of some sort, but Yanukovych is very hands-offish. He's like, because he knows that this is about like a certain type of like Ukrainian far-right kind of ideology, anti-Russian ideology. And in the column, he basically says that Harper, this is writing for the, I think it's the Kingston Whig Standard. He says that Harper is the real Ukrainian nationalist, and the president, the president of Ukraine is the
pales in comparison. Yeah.
That does, and it also goes into how he's the dustbin of history. Anyway, so they're already setting up the nationalist stuff. But unfortunately, I actually do really need to go because it's almost 8 o'clock now, and I got the 2 kids here.
No problem, Yves. We are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Yves Engler. Yves, thank you so much for coming. And Richard, I just have 2 more questions for you before you go. But Yves, thanks so much for coming, and looking forward to seeing you. Oh yes, Mondays. The Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, folks. Subscribe to yvesengler.com so that you can check out that and get to ask Yves questions after he's done giving the news. So later, Yves.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Yeah.
So Richard.
Can I just follow up on one thing that Yves was saying before you asked me those 2 questions? The guy that he was mentioning, Luciak, from a professor at the Royal Military College in Kingston, that he was referring to, his parents were both involved in the security apparatus of the Bandera army. So the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, they were both involved in that. They were both part of that terrorist, far-right, fascist, ethnic cleansing army that killed maybe 130,000 Polish people, and mostly. But they also killed Jews and others. But anyway, so his parents were both involved in that. So it's not a surprise that he turns out the way he does and promotes the propaganda that he promotes.
It's just saying about how apparently Stephen Harper is is more of a real Ukrainian because he believes this kind of half-truth, full-on fake news, junk history about the Holodomor being a genocidal campaign of evil Russians against Ukrainians. Chrystia Freeland actually said something like that. Michael Ignatieff, former leader of the Liberal Party during the Harper years, Chrystia Freeland apparently she said something like us Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, we're actually the real Ukrainians because the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians under the USSR and those who still believe in communism and stuff like that. I mean, basically, I'm paraphrasing what she was saying, but she basically says that they've all been polluted by communism and and Russian influence and so forth. So
wow.
It's astounding, and how left-leaning people do not want to take this baton and expose the fact that Chrystia Freeland is a proud descendant of a Ukrainian Nazi propagandist and associates with civil society groups that continue to lionize Stepan Bandera and have all of these and have all of these scarves and clothings of the Ukrainian flag, but superimposed with Svoboda, the neo-Nazi party and movement in present-day Ukraine. That is just astonishing. But
and that she wrote for the same publications that her grandfather was deeply involved in, that were these publications that, for example, that encyclopedia that I was mentioning, it whitewashes the Holocaust, it whitewashes the Banderites and the Waffen SS, and it's she wrote for them, and that was how she got her start in journalism, which
And
launched her political career later.
But my second to last question is this, you know, is this the scandal in which it's too big to fail, if you know what I mean? So the fact that Canada allowed all of these runaway Nazi war criminals and their family and all these Nazi collaborators into the country, from Yugoslavia to Czechoslovakia to Ukraine, the entire region basically, is the fact that, it's only now somebody like you has broken really this silence, and other, honorable exceptions, whether it's the Canada Files, whether it's our good friend Eve, whether it's Tyler Shipley and so forth, is the fact that, that all of these seemingly benign civil society groups were founded by runaway Nazi war criminals and so forth. But is that scandal is it too big to fail? Because if we break our silence on this, as we were, joking on Facebook, denazification, decolonization, that means that we have to also give up on a lot of previously held historical beliefs, like communism is as evil an ideology as fascism, or we have to, I'm curious your response on that.
Well, I think that you're talking about massive scandals, and I don't think that these huge scandals are going to come out in the mainstream, not for a lot long distant future. I would hope that eventually it'll come out, but there are things from the distant past that have still never come out. So it's not a sure thing that who knows how much will come out. There'll be a limited hangout. They'll be able to admit this, and this will be okay to say that. And then there'll be another huge scandal, and then it'll push the limit a little bit farther. So it's okay to say they'll have to admit something else. It's only if you're forced to admit something that that they will admit it, and that it will become part of the official story. But they'll try to cover up everything that they can as much as they can. But the scandal isn't really just that they brought over these guys, and that the scandal, and that they formed these organizations and associations that now represent their ethnic groups. That's not the scandal. I think the bigger scandal is that the government funded those organizations and promoted them, and that they still are doing that. And I bet you that we come back in a few years, and there will still not have been a mainstream news story about that.
Exactly. But this is why we have to really seize on this momentum, and this is why people have to sign your petition, which demands that Canada stop funding these Eastern European civil society groups, which continue to lionize, airbrush, whitewash, and celebrate their Nazi descendants. And I think the momentum is happening, though, Richard, because every now and then I always try to get people to sign the petition and so forth.
And you see a little
there was a period of time where it was just stunted, where it just wasn't getting at least to a quarter of where it is. But now, let me just check very quickly. Now we're almost there. Only 25 more until reaching the goal of 1945. So hopefully it's not all doom and gloom. But I also want to ask you this question, which is about the future of Ukraine. And my friend Boyan Stanislavski, who's an editor of the Barricade, which is a pan-Eastern European left-wing news outlet, and I've been on his program many times, and he has expressed this on his program, and I've asked a lot of other people who follow Eastern European affairs, the following question, which is: will Ukraine be partitioned into 2 or 3 countries, in which you have Western Ukraine with Kiev as its capital, aligned with the European Union and NATO, and in which the only official language is Ukrainian, but then Eastern Ukraine will either be 2 separate countries or one country, the Donbass, in which in which Russians will no longer be persecuted; they'll be speaking Russian, and either that will be its own country, which most of the international community will recognize, which Russia will recognize, or Eastern Ukraine just becomes part of, the Russian Federation. They have a referendum, and like Crimea, they just join, Russia. Do you think we'll see that happening, given the civil war, the Russian invasion, and the fallout of all of that?
I think that's already happened. Didn't the 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine already have their vote to become part of Russia? They are part of Russia now. Just like Crimea is part of Russia, it's considered part of Russia. Whether it'll be acknowledged or accepted by anybody else, or by, I don't know how many countries have accepted that. But that's the reality on the ground, is that the people there wanted to be part of Russia.
So we're already probably even seeing that, in which Eastern Ukraine just becomes part of Russia, and then Western Ukraine will just be its small country aligned with the West.
Well, that's what it looks like has already happened, and the Russians don't seem to be saying that they're going to give that territory back it's not. Okay, look, being a Canadian, I have to, I can't help but think about what would happen in Canada. In Canada, we have the Quebec, like it used to be New France, and then there was a war. There's a war between Britain and England and France, and the French lost their colony because of a battle and a war and whatnot. And so New France became part of, eventually became part of Canada because of a military operation, a special military operation. And nobody really questions that, except for all these Quebec nationalists who are, some of them, quite a few people. And we allow in Canada the idea that if there's 50% of the population of Quebec plus 1 wants to separate, then they will be able to separate. That's part of our law, as far as I know. It's sort of accepted. People might not want that to happen. A lot of people don't want that to happen. Some people do want it to happen. But that's just the way it goes. We say if they've had a few votes, they didn't get 50%. They got pretty close once. But if they did vote and got 50% plus 1, then they would be able to separate. But why is the same not true in Ukraine? Ukraine was actually bombing. The Ukrainian government was actually bombing the eastern part of Ukraine for 8 years. They killed thousands of people. Imagine if there was a coup in Ottawa, and if thousands of guys who openly support Nazis, Nazis with sticks, nails in it, were attacking the police, and then stormed into the Parliament buildings, and then there was a change in government, and the that side won a coup, and so a fascist-leaning country government took over in Ottawa, and then they started bombing Quebec They lined up the tanks and the artillery, and they flew their warplanes over Quebec, and they were bombing Montreal and bombing Quebec City and killing thousands of people in Quebec because those people said, you know, we don't want to be part of a country that's like been taken over in a Nazi coup. We're proud of our heritage, of our national ethnic ethno-national history, and we're Quebecers, we're French, you know, like that's who we are, and we don't want to be part of that fascist coup that's happened in Ottawa. And then Ottawa starts bombing them. I mean, surely we would. And then they have a vote, and they decide that they're going to separate after 8 years of being bombed. Wouldn't it be fair enough to just say, okay, you know, we recognize your right to self-determination? Like, can't they have a right to self-determination? Or if they decided to be part of another country, what it's isn't it up to them to decide? I don't know. If for some reason here in Canada, people have been able to wrap their minds around the possibility that Quebec could separate, why can't they wrap their minds around the possibility that in eastern Ukraine, if they're being bombed for 8 years, that maybe they would vote in favor of not being a part of that place that's bombing them? You know, it seems understandable to me that they wouldn't want to be part of it. So it's not surprising to me. But then you always hear that it was a Russian invasion, and that you know, they were forced, and they were not. The elections were not real, or the vote was not real, and all that. Well, it seems to me that it's quite plausible that it's very real because they were bombed for all those years. And the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a very pro-NATO kind of a thing, they even acknowledged that you know, they were giving out reports on the number of people that the Ukrainian government was killing leading up to, like, before the Russians moved their troops in and the war started. The Ukrainians were bombing the heck out of Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk. So
Again, folks, I mean, yeah, this is why, we have to really, this is why we have to, again, keep hammering the message that this tragedy of, of the Ukrainian civil war, later the Russian, invasion to push back against the Western-backed, Ukrainian government, this is all the fault of NATO, of Canada, France, Germany, Britain, the United States. NATO is, is the cause of all of this, and Western meddling in Eastern European affairs and in Russian affairs and supporting the most reactionary movements, that's been going on. I think I think even since the Soviet Union was even was even founded, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, as you said when I first interviewed you, it was a counter revolution. It was a color revolution, the first color revolution of its sort. And the West just keeps doing it and doing it, and it's just amazing how how even many left-leaning people just don't just don't see this. But before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your weekend, we end the program with the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and my hero James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. So, Richard, it's your first. It's your turn to do this. So here it goes. So, Richard, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word?
Yeah.
You know what? I have to say that I have to resist. I have to fight back on this one because I have a hard time. People often ask me, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite country? What's your favorite this? What's your favorite that? I don't ever have a favorite. I never have a favorite. Is that a legitimate answer? Or do I have to make something up?
You can make something up if you want.
What's my favorite? Okay, this is my standard response when someone asks me, "What's your favorite this or that? Favorite color, for example. What's your favorite color?" Well, it depends. What is it a color for? Is it for the color of somebody's shirt, or is it a color of somebody's skin? Is it supposed to be the color of the sky? Is it a color of a cloud? Is it a color for a plant? like, I don't know. I can't say what my favorite color is. It depends on the context. So it's maybe the same thing with the word. Like, I don't know what my favorite word is. That's not a real question, is it?
So no favorite word. So then I assume that you
So
definitely
maybe my favorite word is no. My favorite word is no.
okay. What's your least favorite words?
My least favorite word. How many words are you going to ask me for here? My least favorite. I don't have a least favorite word.
Okay,
Least.
no least favorite word. Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually? Yeah, what turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically? Like what inspires you?
What inspires me? I don't know. Okay, that's my favorite inspiration. My favorite source of inspiration.
Yeah,
If we're to convert it into a favorite type of question. I don't know. I don't know.
music, biking, paintings, or
You mean for me to be involved in? Like for me to be actively doing something creative?
well,
What is my favorite way of
just
being
like
creative?
it could be anything, like even like little like little children like playing or something like that.
I don't know. I don't know how to answer questions like that.
Okay, what turns you off? Anything that turns you off? Any particular thing that turns you off?
Yes, I definitely have an answer to that.
Okay.
Besides Nazi collaborators, you mean? Uh, I guess the worst thing could be a Nazi collaborator asking me what my favorite poem was or something.
Then what's your favorite curse word?
Oh, well, I can't say that on the air.
Oh, you
Favorite
can, you
meaning
can.
my go-to curse word?
Yeah,
Are you actually going to put this in the interview?
yeah, yeah. I've asked this to other people in the past, including Eve. So yeah.
Okay, I guess I would have to say the F-bomb.
Okay. Then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Um,
Music, laughter, the ocean.
uh, is this a favorite? What's my favorite noise? Or no, what do I like? Just give
What? Yeah.
me an example.
What? Yeah. What sound or noise do you love, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
I don't know.
Music.
I'm really bad. I'm really no, not necessarily music. I don't know. Depends what mood I'm in. Depends where I am. What am I doing? Am I on a bus or am I in a canoe? Am I what am I doing when I'm hearing this sound?
Okay. All right. Well, I'll leave blank for that. Wow. This is the first time we've ever had a guest that that leaves most of the answers blank. What sound noise do you dislike then?
You mean other people actually have a favorite this and a favorite that? Wow, really? Well, I must there must be something very strange about my brain that I can't even just philosophically deal with the idea that somebody might have a favorite color or a favorite noise
Or a favorite hatred, like what sound or noise do you hate?
or least favorite. You froze up on me. I
Yes,
didn't
yes,
hear what
yes,
you
yes, yes.
said.
Wait, one moment. Okay. Can you hear me now, though? Can you hear me now, Richard? Uh-oh. Hold on. Yes. Hold up. Hold
Yeah, I
up.
can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Then, what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do? So, if you weren't doing the great journalism, history, and activism that you do, what would you have liked to have done?
Well, this one I can say. I can be. I think I have an idea about this one. I'm not actually doing that anymore. I mean, doing this interview with you is kind of like it's kind of an aberration. No, I basically have retired and I don't do these things anymore much, like I'm not doing any more magazines. I think I've told you that before. But what I like to do and what I have been doing for the past year is computer animation. And I've been working on a big computer animation project. It's a surrealist cosmology that explores movie directors.
So you're doing art right now, but in another life, if if you hadn't done all of those,
This is my other life. This is my other life. This is what I'm doing now. Like it's my other life.
Okay.
Because my real life was this, 40 years of working in the peace movement and doing various different campaigns and whatnot. But now I've had a new lease on life and I'm living a new life. So I'm doing this animation. It's quite political. It's still anti-fascist and anti-imperialist, but it's done in a humorous way that is fun and I'm enjoying it. And it's a way to learn how to do that.
And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Coal miner.
Coal miner. Okay. And then lastly, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please still feel free to answer.
What would I want God to say to me?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing that popped into my mind was that he appreciated or she appreciated the good work that I did during my life. My work was appreciated.
Well, Richard, we even though, as you say, you are formally retired of being a lifelong peace activist and journalist and historian and media critic and NGO critic, we still thank you for your service. You still have a lot of knowledge to share with us. Keep doing that great work, and I look forward to seeing that animation once it's done. We were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Richard Sanders, who founded the coalition to oppose the arms trade. As I mentioned before, he was a lifelong peace activist, journalist, historian. Folks, check out, I'm going to make sure to link to Coates' website. And folks, please make sure to sign the petition demanding that Canada stop funding Eastern European civil society groups, expat groups, which lionize Nazi war criminals, and we're also founded by Nazi war criminals. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today, along with Yves Engler. And yes, and have a great weekend. And thank you so much for taking the time to come today.
Well, as Mickey Mouse is my God, thank you for appreciating my work.
You're welcome.
And I just want to.
Okay, it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. And thank you so much for all of your work too. It is much appreciated by many people.